So today we're going to be talking about the films Amistad, which is from 1997, part one of the docuseries The Cause, which is from 1990, and Django Unchained, which is from 2012. So all of these films have in common discussions around the concept of slavery in the United States and the history behind that. And, we're going to connect these topics, or the topics discussed in this film, this topic in particular, to myth ritualism. And one of the big things I want to hit before we sort of deep dive into things that are in common in all three of the films is this concept of religion. So religion is particularly important to myth ritualism just because it serves as sort of the foundation of the study and formation of the theories of myth ritualism. A lot of the concepts we pull from like Greek mythology and different religions around the world that were studied by Fraser and, other myth ritualists. It's very important to myth ritualism, and we kind of see discussions around religion, particularly in Amistad, because these movies are about slavery, and it's such a heavy moral thing to discuss in a society because it's the extreme mistreatment of human beings, and it's just a whole other level of fucked up. And when it comes to religion, I personally like to think of religion as a coping method for our existence in this world. It's our way of sort of giving meaning to the origin of the world and why the world works the way it does, kind of concepts of cosmology. And in particular to films like Amistad, it kind of calls into question, like, we believe in religion as sort of a justification for evil in this world and for pain and for suffering for a higher purpose. But when you see right in front of you the extremes of pain like that, it brings up questions like, are you either deserted by your God, or if you have a concept of God, or are you saved by your God? And, with Amistad in particular, there's definitely discussions around the presence of religion in a world that has slavery in this world. And with abolitionists who believe in Christianity, and we have a character who brings up the idea of martyrdom, and that these African people who were taken from their home would be better off served as martyrs if they died, rather than trying to get them to return to their homes. And, that kind of brings up the fact that this person's view of religion kind of lost the purpose of the fact that we're dealing with human lives, and people deserve more than just death for a cause. They deserve to be treated as people. And, Cinque, he has his own views of religion and his concept of ancestors. And when it comes to, the fiasco of their court case, and it comes down to the nitty-gritty of what's going to happen, are they going to be able to go home? It sort of brings into question whether or not their God or their concept of God will help them after they've gone through so much. And Cinque brings up this quote, this idea that he'll call into the past his ancestors and he'll beg them to help him, and that he will draw his ancestors into his body, and that's the reason why they exist, to help him. And it's interesting to think of this idea of religion being directly tied to your body. It's something that's part of the world, and your ancestors can help you physically live inside your body. So we have that and ultimately they win their case. So we have these discussions about religion, and, it's a very complicated push and pull of, are our gods here to save us? Or how much suffering do we have to withstand for everything to be justified, for it to fit into this perfect narrative? Well, things just happen the way they happen. Concepts of religion are hard to analyze because it's something that can be so personal to people. And you can analyze it in a more like emotionally detached way of just saying like religion is a coping mechanism for understanding our existence in the world. It's just one way of understanding humanity, not that everybody has to be religious. And, in this set of films, we see a more sort of escapist revenge fantasy that isn't centered around religion, and this idea that there's a peaceful way of going about things by going through the law, even though Amistad, in that case, they physically rioted against the people who captured them, and people did end up dying. Django Unchained takes it on a whole other level of being an escapist revenge fantasy that's focused on, sort of justice, and, its commentary on this idea of a world that still centers itself around slavery, and then also the standards that we hold ourselves up to now. Like, do we need extreme violence for there to be justice for how people have been wronged? That if society in the past collectively agreed that slavery was okay, then what standards do we hold ourselves up to now because we no longer think that. So how do we push a new agenda? Is violence necessary? And we kind of see in these films in particular, this was, if we think of fighting as a ritual, like in relation to one of the older videos of talking about Kill Bill and martial arts, violence being a ritual, way of reflecting on your beliefs and fighting for what you believe in. If we think about history and defeating people in battle, the living people get to write history. So who decides who's right in the end? The more powerful, the masses, the winners. If for so long slave owners were able to dominate slaves, were they justified in that because they were able to do it for so long and that was the norm? So I think these films sort of poke at that idea, especially Django Unchained, because the morals, this idea of justice and what's accepted by a society is dependent on the morals and the beliefs of society. They perpetuate each other, and myth and ritual are representative. They reflect what we believe as a society. And there's the differing opinions of individuals, but largely it's our history is shaped by our accepted myths and rituals. And we can think of in these instances of films, myth being like the documents of our rules and our beliefs. So if we think about our founding documents for America, which are specifically spoken about in Amistad, they're representations of these concepts of freedom that are integral to the idea of the U.S. And for Amistad, they question, well, if we say that all men are created equal, what about the women and the children and the people of color who aren't included in that word men? So I think those are really important discussions we have, and they connect to myth. And so if we go into ritual, we see the relationship of myth and ritual in the idea of ritual being the enactment of these rules. They're the enactment of myth. So the courtroom in Amistad, and courtrooms in general, are the enactment of our rules in society, holding people to these standards. And it's literally referred to as storytelling in the film, so it's easier to connect it to this idea of myth and ritual if we think of myth being storytelling and remnants of our past. And in a more extreme, violence-centered way in Django Unchained, we see rituals as within the concept that rituals are a reflection of our society. We see slave auctions, whippings, and these are repeated practices that are a means of controlling another people, and they're reflections of what was accepted. And they're so centered around this idea of us versus them, that one person is more deserving of freedom or rights than another. And The Cause, the docuseries in 1990, we see this sort of analysis of what was the cause of the Civil War and this debate over slavery and how the nation was sort of torn apart. But the interesting thing about this film in particular, or this docuseries, is that it personalizes history. It doesn't just look at the facts. This film makes it a point to include people's personal lives and their stories and their photographs, replications of their voice. And, it sort of captures the myths, the stories of the people. And we see a quote in the film that says, "No longer would there be living memory of battles, only history and legends," after discussing veterans of the war passing away. And so this concept that once a people who have lived through their myths and who have lived through society and their own experiences, that afterwards their experiences just become legends. They become the myths we hold on to, is really interesting to think about, and sort of how both of these films are reflections on the lives of other peoples. They're the representations of these myths after time has passed. And so I want to cycle back a little bit to this concept of violence, because it's especially important in these discussions of slavery, because so much pain was enacted on African American people. In Django, they're bounty hunters. So they carry out the will of society, or at least of order in society, this concept of law and a criminal justice system holding people up to a standard of rules. But they also get to dictate, in a way, who is bad in society. And, this sort of gauge of who is bad is measured off of, have they killed people? Have they harmed other people? And ironically, to cancel that out, they kill these people. And we know that Django, his motivation is to get his wife back. So in a way, it's sort of the cost of receiving life in this instance is to take life. And so it's an interesting reflection of how human life works. And so it's a cycle that kind of perpetuates itself, and it's achieved through means of violence. And is this reflective of slavery in the US? Like, all of these films have such rich discussions around the concepts of slavery and reactions to our history. And, you know, they're so connected to myth and ritual once you sort of look a little deeper into the inner workings of each of these films.